This is Floss Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week, Aaron Newcomb and I are talking with John Mertic of the Linux Foundation about the Open Mainframe Project and a whole lot more. I've never understood the Linux Foundation as well as I do now after I talked to John. So that's coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is Floss Weekly, episode 624, recorded Wednesday, April 7th, 2021. Open Mainframe Project. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Bitwarden. Get the password manager that offers a robust and cost-effective solution that can drastically increase your chances of staying safe online. Get started with a free trial of a Teams or Enterprise plan, or try it for free across all devices as an individual user at bitwarden.com/twit. And by Technology Powers X. Learn how technology is reshaping business through an original podcast from Dell Technologies. Search for Technology Powers X anywhere you listen to podcasts and download each episode today. Good morning, good day, good whatever it is, wherever you are in the world. I am Doc Searls, and this here is Floss Weekly. And my co-host today is the great Aaron Newcomb. There, Aaron? There he is.
I am. How's it going?
In his lair. Wow. Yeah, the wide angle does wonders for that. So
we're using Zoom today, so you can actually. So I've got my background on. And
that's
you can
right.
See
this is
what it looks like when you're facing from behind me, looking forward.
Yeah. So you have a background. My background is what people call my story chair, which is actually. I'm in a borrowed house. This is my last time you'll see me here. So I'm in San Marino, California. You're in somewhere else in California, I believe.
Yeah, I'm in northern, just north of San Francisco.
Excellent. So our guest today is John Mertic of the Linux Foundation. Are you up to date on what he's up to yet? Or I've done a less than adequate job for crazy reasons, but
I will say John's name sounds familiar to me. So we must have crossed paths either at a conference or something. And just looking at his bio, it looks like he's done a lot of work on Sugar CRM and those types of things. So I'm sure at some point we've crossed paths. But it looks like it should be a pretty interesting show, especially with the work that he's doing on Open Mainframe.
Yeah, the sugar one is an interesting one to me because an old friend is Larry Augustin, who was a Linux figure way back when, and I haven't seen him in a few years, but I'm not sure. I'm sure he doesn't miss me, but we did a lot of stuff together back in the decade. So I'm eager to get this thing running. But first, I want to tell you that this episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Bitwarden. What is the easiest way for businesses and individuals to store, share, and sync sensitive data? Bitwarden. Bitwarden is the only open source cross-platform password manager that can be used at home, on the go, or at work. One of the biggest challenges for business is to empower employees to follow password management best practices. By giving your employees Bitwarden, they can securely store credentials spanning across business and personal worlds. Every Bitwarden account begins with the creation of a personal vault, which allows the user to store their own personal credentials. Use Bitwarden for your business. When an individual joins a team or a company, they can be assigned to the organizational vault for access to shared credentials. Quicker access means quicker productivity. Also, Bitwarden is fully customizable. You can turn on or off features using enterprise policies to adapt to your business needs. Generate unique and secure passwords for every site your employees access and ensure a password is not used more than once. You'll minimize the risk of using weak and vulnerable passwords. Customize and set password requirements and administrative policies that will empower employees to practice good password hygiene. You'll get enterprise-grade security, and Bitwarden conducts regular third-party security audits and is compliant with Privacy Shield, HIPAA, GDPR, CCPA, SOC 2, and SOC 3 security standards. Unite your existing systems with Bitwarden using SSO authentication, directory services, or powerful APIs. Get up and running fast using Bitwarden Cloud, or gain complete control with the option to self-host. You'll be able to monitor and manage security vulnerabilities using the Bitwarden Vault Health reports with actionable insights to exposed, reused, weak, or potentially compromised passwords, as well as identify any items in your vault with inactive 2FA. Mitigate the likelihood of successful phishing attacks by storing passwords and other sensitive information with an end-to-end encrypted vault. Bitwarden is an open-source password manager trusted by millions of individuals, teams, and organizations worldwide for secure password storage and sharing. Get the password manager that offers a robust and cost-effective solution that can drastically increase your chances of staying safe online. Get started with a free trial of a Teams or Enterprise plan at bitwarden.com/twit, or try it for free across devices as an individual user. That's bitwarden.com/twit. Okay, I want to welcome our guest, John Mertic. John is the Director of Program Management for the Linux Foundation. Under his leadership, he's helped the AWSF, ODPI, Open Mainframe Project, the R Consortium, accelerating open source innovation and transform industries. He has an open source career spanning 2 decades, both as a contributor to projects such as Sugar CRM and PHP, and in open source leadership roles and many other things. That a whole paragraph goes on beyond that I'm reading right now. But I'd rather talk to John. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And excited to be back on the show. It's I've been here a few times in different capacities, and it's always great to be on and talking to you both.
Thanks. So where are you in the world, just so we can locate these things?
I am based just outside of the Cleveland, Akron, Ohio area.
Oh, excellent. What town there?
So the town is called Doylestown.
Uh-huh.
If anyone is very familiar with it. It's about halfway between Akron and Worcester. So I'm somewhat closer to the main part of the town, but I have a farm field right behind me. So a little mix of both.
I've just always been, I thought maybe I might hit a bullseye with Chagrin Falls, which I just thought was always a perfect name for a town.
But that's a beautiful town up there. My wife made it up there quite a bit. So it's about an hour away, but really nice.
Yeah, more like a close-in suburb. So okay, you've been here. So refresh us on what some of the other things you've done here, so people can look you up in prior, because I think we have online pretty much everything we've done. Over 13 years.
Yeah. I think a couple of years ago, I was on with Sugar CRM and sort of talking about that when I was a community manager over there. I've been in a couple of times, I believe, around actually the Linux Foundation and some of these open source projects that I've been working with. I've been with the Open Mainframe Project Linux Foundation for going on 6 years. So I think there's been a couple episodes where we spoke to a bit of that as well.
Were you at Sugar CRM and Larry Augustin was there, or did you post-date him?
I was with it. Is there? So when he took over as CEO, was probably about a year or two after I was there, and then I was there for the entire time there. I met him a couple times, went out to dinner with him. I had one of my first really big experiences of meeting people in open source through him. I think having a dinner with him and Chris Devona and Dirk. A few years ago, I always remember that as sort of a very kind of awing moment for me in open source.
I remember once because I said to Larry that, who has a wonderful voice, that he had a bad face. He had a bad face for radio, but but because I meant he was good looking. He didn't know how to take the joke. Anyhow, so tell us about your work with the Linux Foundation now, and then we can go into some of the particulars.
Yeah, so I work with a lot of our larger project communities, the Open Mainframe Project, which I have the T-shirt for. But I also work across their data and AI initiatives, Academy Software Foundation, which is focused on open source in the motion picture industry, along with the LF Edge Energy Foundation, which is focused on open source, clean energy, renewable energy, and energy kind of grid transformation that's happening within that sphere. And a lot of the work I do is working with the project communities, really in helping get them up and going, help support and get governances in place for them, help sort of support some of the challenges you run into when you're getting an open source project up and going. And with each of these, they are what we kind of call like an umbrella foundation. So think of it as one foundation that hosts a number of different projects that are all related in some way or another. So the Open Mainframe Project, for example, we have 18 projects and they're all related because they are open source that is directed towards the mainframe and helping connect the mainframe back into broad enterprise. The Academy Software Foundation is open source that is used within movie production. So that's sort of how we classify and group a lot of those in. And I work with these foundations and the projects therein to really just help get them going, help, work them through the processes of getting governance, how processes work, help supporting issues they run into. Basically everything except writing code, because you don't want to see my code anymore.
So I'm wondering, what's the definition of a foundation? So the Linux Foundation itself is a foundation. It's called a foundation, and I think most people know what it means. It's a nonprofit. It's a big thing. Things run on it because it's a foundation, right? But this is a foundation that has foundations, and the foundations are umbrellas or under umbrellas, and sometimes what happens within them is not as obvious as you might think. Like I went to the CNC, the Cloud Network, the CNCF event back when events could be held in the physical world. I went to one of those in a big convention center, which are now obsolete and taking up space, like shopping malls. But and I was surprised to find it was mostly, at least in that occasion, about 5G, and it was about getting big companies that normally would not get along to get along, right? So here are all these big name brand companies that happen to be doing some open source work that were actually working together on code that they would all need, and really there was no need to be proprietary about that code because it was too low level. And hey, they're all going to have local clouds for their 5G, so it was really about 5G, and it was kind of like. And I at the time I was wondering, well, is the elephant in the room here that everybody's going to be competing with Amazon or not? And because they all have little sharded hunks of stuff, and it wasn't about that. It was still just about we're doing this low level work. We're all together on this thing, and that was a foundation. But so tell me about what kind of. I'm almost wondering, maybe another way of putting this is the LF actually kind of creating a new model of foundations within foundations here somehow?
I mean, I think I would say it's kind of like an evolution of models that we've seen over time. I mean, if you roll back a couple decades, you saw things like the GNOME Foundation and the Free Software Foundation and folks like that. And I think the Apache Software Foundation was sort of the first move to a foundation that is hosting multiple different open source projects, and done a lot within the context of many of these projects. There's sort of similar resources they can all benefit from. And as opposed to each project having to, get all of its resources on its own, if there's a set of shared resources, server infrastructure, governance policies, licensing structure, things like that, or even, just some of the basic of just, trademark and asset holding and management, there's a ton of benefit that comes from that. The next evolution is really with the Linux Foundation, and Doc, you hit it right on the nose. It's a foundation of foundations. So we have the ability here to host different efforts in multiple different verticals and horizontals, each with their own sort of funding entity within those. And then the next level of model underneath that is then projects that are a part of each of those. And each of those projects that are within a particular umbrella, they're all related in some way. Like I said, whether that be topical area, focus area, or whatnot. But I think with a lot of the idea is exactly what you said. It's able to bring together a lot of organizations that may have not ever had a venue or medium to collaborate in, a place to do that collaboration, and a place to do that collaboration where it's all vendor neutral. There's not one vendor that owns all the code. There's not one vendor that gets to make all the decisions. There's not decisions made behind closed doors. Everything's done out in the open. All of the technical governance and decision making happens out there, and it's done within the concept of a duocracy of if people are showing up and doing the work, they get to make the decisions. And I think that's a lot of the model that we really have tried to promote, because as we've grown into different industries, you just recognize that each industry is just different of how they collaborate. I think you were mentioning 5G with the LF networking. They have a lot of very unique standards that they're working with. How they bring these open source projects to market are all different. And so ensuring that there's a governance that matches that, but at the same time enables these companies to really take advantage of the ethos and really how open source works is a huge, huge benefit. And it transforms these industries. 5G rollout is a lot because of open source. All of these, fancy infotainment systems we have in our cars and how that technology has evolved is thanks to open source. All of the VFX and special effects that you see in movies today, all thanks to open source in the back end. And the ability for these organizations to collaborate on these technologies is huge. And so that's really kind of a lot of the model. That's really the venue that we provide. So
this brings to mind, because I have a lot of mileage. An interesting contrast. Back in the 80s, I did work with Sun Microsystems on their Spark project and the Spark RISC project. And I remember before that came, maybe about the same time, maybe it might have been before, there was everybody wanted like the one Unix. Linux hadn't showed up yet. And AT&T owned Unix, as it were, and they had something called System 5 Release 4, SVR4, and maybe after that SVR5. And there was this meeting at Sun with like the heads of the 5 families of different outfits that were working on different kinds of Unix, and how are we going to make this work for all of us somehow? And now this is at a time when the phrase open source, that didn't show up until 1998, so it was more than a decade after this. But they had, so a consortium was formed, and actually Scott McNeely there, immediately a rivals one was formed. I forget what that one was about, but I mean, but it was, and later happened with Identity with the WS Star Foundation versus the Liberty Alliance, and both of them sounded, and came on kind of like the evil empire in Star Wars, and you almost expected to hear the Darth Vader music coming along with them. And that's what consortiums were. And they were these warring bands. And now, but then Linux came along and Linux succeeded, and that's probably what paved the way. But the Linux Foundation strikes me as like a really inspired way to overcome that stuff, because basically the thing these companies were arguing about was stuff they really didn't need to argue about because it was too low level to argue about, right? I mean, even Apple ends up using BSD, and Microsoft isn't making its own browser anymore. They're basing it on Chromium, because why even bother having your own low-level code underneath the browser when there's other code that's laying around that's already useful? So I'm wondering if you just tell us a little bit about the model in that respect, which is is not so much peacekeeping. It's more like, what are our common interests here? What can we work on in common?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Sometimes there is peacekeeping. I mean, we sometimes know open source communities can feud a little bit, but I think a lot of it is a very healthy discussion that's happening within communities, and a lot of it it's very driven on technical direction and pieces like that. I think the really big things that we try to instill with in our communities is, one of just making sure all the decision making is very open and transparent, so that really anybody can get involved, anybody can see what's going on. That's always one of the criticisms of anything in open source, is how are these made? How can I get involved? It doesn't make sense. And the more you make that open and transparent, the more that it just builds trust. And that's often one of the big challenges organizations run into with open source. They might, there's always the sort of the first level of trust of, oh, this code's open source, it's all out there. How can I, trust that it's secure? How can I trust all this? And I think the more that we've seen over time is the more that all of the layers become more and more transparent, all of that downstream trust, starts to build over time. And when you start to have that trust model, it opens up the ability for people then to come and participate. The cloud vendor model that you described is a really good one. There's probably not a lot of venues other than open source that you could see all of the major cloud vendors coming together on standard technologies that effectively are really the base of where these technologies are going. But they're also the way that then it helps them move forward to just do new and interesting things. It lets each of them actually focus a lot of their talent energy on what makes them unique versus all of that sort of that low level pieces there. So in a lot of our roles, we are sitting there and really trying to help the community move forward, but with them sort of at the lead of the direction they're going. We have a ton of ancillary services on the back end here that we help provide, but a lot of our goal and a lot of this is driven from our project operations and program management teams is, we partner and work with these communities. We don't make the decisions for the communities. They make them themselves. We challenge them to help them make them themselves, but we're there as a partner. We're there as an advisor. We've seen a lot of this unfold. You saw from my biography that I've worked with a ton of these before, and you start to see many patterns develop. And so you can help provide recommendations. You can help provide guidance. You can help sort of warn if they're kind of getting into an area that's going to be an anti-pattern. But, more or less, we let these communities take the role. As long as they're working in an open and transparent manner, as long as the license is actually an open source license, which is very helpful. Those I think are really the key tenets there. And then from there, we just bring the experience that we have seen across a lot of these efforts and really work then to enable them to accelerate innovation. We do everything but write the code, drive the technical direction. And each of the projects operates autonomously. They have to come up with how they get contributors. They have to come up with how a contributor becomes a committer. They have to come up with how you do releases. And we can help give them guidance. We can help share examples of what we've seen work in other places. But in the end, they have to sort of come up with works best for them. And as it turns out, each time that can be very unique based upon the people that are coming together, the constituents, what they're actually building, So, technology that's built for a mainframe is going to have probably a different set of, release cadence and release qualifications and how you go about processes versus something built for an automobile. Because they're going to also have a different set of standards they have to uphold. They have, different pipelines of development. So it can just all be different. And I think our role is to just help support them so that they can, drive forward and focus on the technology and not really have to worry about all of that ancillary stuff in the background that is really, really important for an open source project to be successful, but is not a first nature thing for someone leading an open source project.
I know we want to get to Open Mainframe, but this topic is so interesting. Let me just ask one more question.
Go for it.
I've always been interested in this part of it. Like all the things that you said so far about helping these projects, and there are a ton of them. If you follow the rabbit hole down, talking about CNCF, for example. CNCF has hundreds of projects just under CNCF, right? So, right. So I'm just kind of wondering, do you also help with funding for these projects? Because, we've talked about all of these, helping with releases and helping developers work collaboratively, blah, 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 and that's all great. But, what about funding? How does that play into this?
Yeah. So we work with a lot of our umbrella foundations that choose if they want to have like a membership funding model of helping put that in place for them, and all of the back end work of just administrating like how you get funds, how you disperse it, how to work with the projects to develop budgets, and sort of what the key components of that are. And help it also to make it as simple as possible for them, so they don't have to be accounting majors. They can, look at it just kind of the same way of how they would manage their home budget. And so we try to make it really, really simple for them. Also, in addition, we help provide a lot of additional shared services that they might have had to go out and get on their own. But we have a lot of those capabilities in-house we're able to take advantage of. So like, for example, the project wants to design some cool artwork and logos. We have a whole creative services team. The project wants to run their own event. We have an event management team. And by the way, that event management team, yes, it does in-person events the day we actually get back to go and doing those. But they've also kind of led the industry on doing virtual events and some of the amazing things we've been doing there. If they want to develop training programs, we have a team that's able to do that. So we have also a lot of in-house expertise that are able to take advantage of. I have in-house counsel as well that can help on things such as like license compliance, license scanning, and other sort of trademark and other issues that might potentially come up. So we have a lot of that available, and we can work with the project to do that. We also have tools on our LFX platform, and one of them is a crowdfunding tool. So projects that maybe don't want to go sort of a membership model, they also have the ability to raise funds on a crowdfunding tool. And the crowdfunding tool is nice. It's really easy for the projects to use. It actually maintains a completely transparent ledger. So anyone who wants to give money to the project, they can see exactly to the penny of how all that money is spent. So that gives it just a ton of transparency to those projects, or to folks in the community of what's happening. So I guess it's kind of a various funding model, just depending upon what the project is looking to do, who are the key constituents, what does the market look like around it, and we really try to adapt to what makes the most sense. At a minimum, like you can see here, some of the benefits to all projects. We have some very basic things that any project, whether it comes with funding or not, has that it can take advantage of. And a lot of it is within having a vendor neutral ownership, IP, and tooling like that that's already available for them.
Wow. I mean, it's almost like we should have had a whole separate
we can keep going on this. I'm always so interested in this because this is a lot of fun.
Well, I do want to talk about, we can come back to it for a little bit, but I do want to at least get in Open Mainframe because you took the time to put on the correct t-shirt this morning, which yes. I always forget to do. So let's talk a little bit about what Open Mainframe is and how that got started. That's under the system administration umbrella I see here. It looks like if you were to subdivide things under Linux Foundation. So what is Open Mainframe? What's the goal?
So the main goal is how can mainframes be a part of the enterprise IT? The one trend that I have seen for decades, and this community sees it as well, is the forward-thinking enterprises, they don't buy from one vendor. They buy from a lot of different vendors. They don't all in the cloud. They have infrastructure all over the place. Some of them are using a lot of cloud. Some of them have servers on their own that they're hosting. Many of them are looking into IoT and edge nodes. And if we look at some of the large organizations, many of them also have mainframes. And these mainframes, they power our society. If you've used a credit card today, it's thanks to a mainframe. I always say if you've got on a plane, but people don't, I guess, do that as much right now. But in the event that you get on a plane or a train, that's thanks to a mainframe. So much of the backbone of our government, our healthcare industry, and other really key verticals is powered by it. And where this project looks to serve is how can the projects that we're hosting here be that way so that the mainframe can interconnect within the enterprise on the tooling that they're commonly already using, such as very common DevOps tooling, REST APIs, common development languages, common development practices. All of the projects we host are really focused in that area of making those connections and making it easier for an enterprise to use the mainframe that they have, or maybe look at saying, hey, the mainframe has some really nice value propositions. If you need a computing system that is secure, performant, scalable, and all of these bits turned up to an 11, all at the very same time, mainframe's the only system on the planet that can do all of those things, and it's been a guiding design principle of that architecture for decades now. And we see a lot of companies that they need that as maybe not their whole application or a big part of it. So the mainframe being able to be a serviceable part of that is a key important thing to enterprises. And our goal is to enable the open source that connects the mainframe back all within that world.
Very cool. Well, I know we have some more thoughts on Open Mainframe and what's going on. Excuse me. So if we break this down, because we've talked about mainframe before several times on this show, we've had updates on Mainframe Project. We just had, who did we have on from IBM? The brain goes bad as you get older, I think. But anyway, we just had a show talking about Maybe. I'll have to look it up. The chat room will tell us who was on. But anyway, so we've talked about this a lot. We've talked about Linux on the mainframe and the history there. I mean, you brought up some good points about how you can do things with mainframe. How there's still the death of the mainframe is not coming anytime soon because there's still so much you can do with it. But who's really still? Is there anyone adopting this? It's like, I guess my question is, instead of taking advantage of the mainframe that you still have on the floor, right? Is anybody still looking at this as I want to purchase a mainframe because I can only do things with it? Or is it only people saying, look, I've had this mainframe technology sitting around and I want to take advantage of it to extend the lifetime of it?
So we definitely see a lot of folks that are using mainframes that are actually increasing a lot of their usage of it, particularly because some of the technologies that we've brought to market, one of them is Zoe, which is designed to be the connection point between ZOS, which is probably the most common operating system that is used on the mainframe, back with tooling such as REST APIs, command line interfaces, things like that. Basically, you could be on your laptop and you could be using a command line interface to interact with your mainframe as opposed to a 3270 terminal. So we are seeing as companies are rolling out the use of Zoe and they're connecting it back within various tooling they have, we're starting to see those companies actually increase the amount of mainframe usage that they're having. We're also seeing, and I think a lot of this is based on the Linux side of things, because you already see companies that are obviously very familiar with Linux. They're using Linux in the cloud. They're probably using Linux on their edge nodes and all sorts of other areas. You're also starting to see companies look at the mainframe specifically for different parts of their workloads. The growth of microservices has really enabled folks to think of a mainframe and think of sort of like, what are the key areas that my application could really benefit from very high transactional speed and a highly secured environment. And they're saying, hey, let's float that part of that to a mainframe because it's going to be able to do it better than any of our other systems. But yet we can have all the rest of parts of the application maybe hosted on the cloud or maybe hosted on different sorts of parts. So we're starting to see a lot of growth within, probably some of the more traditional sectors, such as finance and transportation. But we're also seeing some other interesting areas. There was an organization called Plastic Bank, which focuses on the growing amount of plastic in our oceans. They were using a mainframe on the back end for a lot of the compute processing to keep some of those pieces up. So we're starting to see some novel uses of it out there, especially as it's becoming a bit more accessible, especially with Linux being, very heavily supported and really a first-class citizen on the platform. And also even with the introduction of some of the newer hardware that is designed to fit in like a standard, data center rack as well. So It's really starting to percolate up, and I think we've very much have noticed that. When I started with this project 6 years ago, I would always have to start, explaining what a mainframe is. And now as I'm going into conversations, people are a lot more aware of what a mainframe truly is. And they're able to really start to see a lot of the benefits. And in some cases, they're actively using some of the projects that we host. And that's making a huge difference.
I want to ask a question about time horizons, but first, I want to let you know this episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Technology Powers X, an original podcast by Dell Technologies. Each episode of Technology Powers X focuses on a different industry and goes behind the scenes to help you understand how technology is reshaping business everywhere. I'm very enthused about this, the whole idea of a podcast sponsoring a podcast and cross-promoting them. It's a great idea. A recent episode features researchers who are studying the architecture of the human brain in an effort to develop more versatile AI models. Another explores the world of professional esports, featuring behind-the-scenes looks at Team Liquid and their star CSGO player, Elige, E-L-I-G-E, but pronounced Elige, or Allege. And one episode talks about vertical farming and how innovative new tech can change where our food comes from and how this may be the future of sustainably feeding 21st century populations. Technology Powers X is hosted by Danielle Applestone, a hardware engineer and entrepreneur. If you're a pet lover, check out episode 14, The Best Partner for Pets. Here is a clip.
Yet today, technology plays a growing role, not just in happy reunions, but as an invaluable tool to America's animal welfare workers.
Search for Technology Powers X anywhere you listen to podcasts and download each episode today. That's Technology Powers X. Download it today. My thanks to Technology Powers X for their support. So I want to ask about time horizons because you guys are involved with RISC-V now. We talked about this a bit before the show. I mentioned earlier my work with Sun Microsystems 1,000 years ago when there was a Sun Microsystems, and they were like a colossus ruling parts of the world anyway. And they had Spark, which is one of the RISC designs at the time, and Intel was still defending the x86 architecture, and but everybody felt that RISC was going to take over in the next 5 minutes, and it really didn't for a long time. And it seems to me that there's a consciousness at the Linux Foundation that almost everything you're working on is kind of downstream, but even in the downstream areas, like nothing could be more downstream than mainframes. But we just said to Aaron in answer to the last question is that in some ways you're rediscovering and redefining what a mainframe is and what our dependencies are on it in the world. And so I'm kind of wondering what the long view there is and how that works, because it seems to me you've got one.
Frame specifically, or are you thinking broader with the
I'm
Linux
thinking
Foundation?
more broadly, but mainframes too. I mean, it's that, like the CNCF, right? This is, what is cloud nativity? It seems that you're pulling a bunch of companies together. They're kind of learning from each other. There's, open source itself now seems to be a bit more of a corporate thing, but the corporations themselves are learning about it in a way that isn't what they might have thought a few years ago. So I'm sort of, it seems to me there's, and maybe I'm projecting this, but it seems to me there's a bit of a consciousness on the Linux Foundation's part that there are a bunch of long games being played here in the kind of transformations you're looking for or facilitating.
Yeah, there absolutely is. And I think that's sort of you could argue it's a little bit of the luxury of where we're at in the role of the Linux Foundation is we can provide a home for these technologies, these technologists, for these collaboration ideas. We can give them sort of the space to really figure things out. We can share a lot of the best practices with it. Sometimes we even run into efforts that are even a little bit in competition with each other. And usually the market has a great way of shaking those things out. But I think the big thing is that we try to instill is, the values of how you do collaboration in this form, and how you can also best measure of whether you're doing a good job for it, and whether you're being a good citizen back to these projects. I mean, I remember talking with some open source communities many years ago, and they're like, "Oh, geez, this company showed up and they dumped a bunch of code and they're expecting us to deal with it." And one of the things that we try to help work with these companies is, okay, if you're taking part in open source, there are kind of things you have to do. You can't just show up and have demands. You show up and get to understand the people. You get to understand how the project works. You get to understand sort of the technology space. You get to understand sort of how decisions are made and how conversation happens, and what some of the standards are within those communities. And then as you put more into it, you get more out of it. And I think we try to stick with a lot of like the core principles in those areas. And really, we just try to provide a mechanism that these smart people can get together and have the exact conversations that you're talking about, and put all the pieces around it so that they can focus on having that conversation, without sort of getting bogged down by all of the other sort of accessory stuff that comes around it. And, I think if we're thinking about like how these technologies continue to form and how open source is grow, I mean, yes, we're seeing a lot more open source use in corporations, and I think that's honestly, it's a good sign. It's a good thing. I mean, I know there's many that might think of, oh, geez, that's an anti-pattern, but I mean, I think to a degree it's made it mainstream. But I think a lot of the ethos of how one collaborates in this way still doesn't change. And if anything, we're seeing companies start to establish open source program offices, and internal open source practices, that are saying, not how can open source adopt to what we do as a company, but how can we as a company look at the principles that open source has driven and it's about, and how can we fit into that? So if anything, open source ends up being sort of the leader in that way. And we're seeing pretty much every company on the planet, whether it be a traditional tech company, whether it be a financial institution, whether it be a 50-person, little local web dev shop, all of them are forming open source strategy practices within them because they see the immense value and this joint collaboration that's out there. They want to take part of it. They want to benefit from it, but they also see the opportunity to helping, really just drive a lot of that forward. So it's kind of almost more like at a really unique time with an open source that, yes, it's kind of like got mainstream, but it's not sometimes where you think of something got mainstream and so then you've lost all the kind of the cool and fun things about it. It's got mainstream, but it still has retained a lot of what it's all about. And if anything, people are having to adapt to it versus open source having to adapt to something else. I don't know if that helps answer your question.
No, I think you're totally right. As you were talking, I was just thinking about how the paradigm has slipped, right? It used to be that some commercial company would come up with some cool thing, and then there would be an open source project that would come up to try to kind of emulate that. Maybe not exactly, but there would be an open source version of that software, right? Or whatever. And now it seems like to have flipped the other way around. I know the company that I work for, Sysdig, by the way, thank you, Sysdig, for giving me time to be on the show today. We started with open source and we're based on open source. We're still a commercial company because we add value on top of that, but we started with the open source Sysdig project, and we contributed file code to CNCF, and we base a lot of what we do on Falco and Prometheus and Kubernetes. It's all baked in, and we try to not only contribute back to those products, but maintain, the standards that those open source projects have set. So we started with that as a base, in other words, as opposed to coming from the other way around, coming up with some cool proprietary project, and then, coming up with an open source version of it. So I think it's interesting that that's changed. I wanted to ask you, one of the interesting things about the pandemic, as we're hopefully on the tail end of it here over the next 3 to 6 months. Yes. I know that there's been like an increase in a need for like things that you wouldn't expect, like COBOL programmers, right, are in high demand right now. Because a lot of these old systems. Who would have
thought like 18 months ago we'd be talking about COBOL, right?
Exactly. But I'm kind of curious from both the mainframe standpoint and just from the Linux Foundation standpoint, like how has the pandemic affected what you guys do? Not in terms of how you operate, but are you having to help these projects in different ways because of the effects of the pandemic?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we've seen all sorts of new and interesting things come from it. I mean, we've seen the launch of a public health foundation within the Linux Foundation, which has, been focused on, the technologies around that space, not only thinking specifically about COVID-19, but also what comes after that. We have seen folks really moving more towards a lot of online and digital learning because you can't go to conferences right now. So this is the only way you can learn. And our events team, in the early days of the pandemic, spent 6 weeks and researched all of the platforms out there and spent a lot of time figuring out these communities. They want to get together. They want to engage with one another. They can't do it in person, and it's really frustrating. But what is a way that we can emulate that as strong as possible? And they've really tried to lead the way in figuring out ways to do that in a very professional way, but also in a way that's really engaging a lot of folks. And a lot of those pieces of, transform over time. And I think another thing that we've started to see is, and I think it's great that you mentioned the COBOL bit there, because I think we're right about a year, at least I think just almost right about a year ago is when you started to see some particular state governors throwing their hands up in the air and saying, oh, this COBOL, we can't do anything about it. It's making all of our unemployment systems run slow, yada, 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 yada. As it turns out, I don't think the COBOL was really the problem, but that's, I guess, beside the point. But what we have seen is different parts of our society have been taxed in different ways that we have never expected or encountered ever before. And I think unemployment in those systems, which many of them are built upon decades and decades of, code, a lot of those on technologies that, maybe aren't the newest and shiniest. There's probably not a whole lot of unemployment systems that are written in Rust, for example. You never know. There probably is one. Somebody in the chat will find it. But there has been a need that we have seen arise to help step in there and help make a difference and help bring those things forward. One of my proudest moments in working here was with the Open Mainframe Project. Within a week of really the need for COBOL programmers hitting the mainstream and hitting the 6 o'clock news, we had launched initiatives of COBOL training materials, which are all available under Creative Commons licenses, so anybody can use. And they're not COBOL training materials where you need a 3270 terminal. They're COBOL training materials that you can use VS Code, with. We launched a forum so that if you are a COBOL programmer and you're available for work or donation or volunteer time, that you could announce your availability. And we had, I think within a week or so, we had like over 1,000 people that raised their hand to say, hey, I'm a COBOL programmer. I'm here to help. Like if you need COBOL resources, I'm here. And furthermore, then we've also started to see a language like COBOL start to look towards, and I hate to always say modern because it makes COBOL seem old, because it's really a technology that's still being taught. It's has a lot of legacy built behind it. But, where you would normally see certain tooling available for a language like unit testing, like debugging, like different sorts of frameworks available, COBOL didn't have a lot of that out there. And a lot of it really came from its legacy is, I grew up a computer science grad. Most people who were computer science grads were not taught COBOL. If you were in the business administration or the business science schools, you were taught COBOL. It's the same way as math majors were probably taught a lot of MATLAB and things like that, where computer science major may not be or R, for example, where a computer science major wouldn't have been exposed to that. So with that, you've seen a lot of disconnects between COBOL evolving as a language and the common tooling around that. And one of the projects that we just launched, which is called COBOL Check, is a unit testing framework for COBOL so that you can do test-driven development in COBOL, which is an absolutely fantastic idea. Anybody who's been doing programming for the last 20 years is going to look at it and says, okay, it's about darn time. But the point is we're starting to see many of these organizations where and even government agencies where the trend might have been of how do we take this old COBOL stuff and rewrite it in something else? You're not seeing that really actively being as pursued. Now you're seeing is how do I invest more into this? Because there's a ton of value here. It's really hard for me to recreate. But if I have tooling and everything that is helping accelerate and helping make the quality of that code better, let's invest that way. Because I don't want to redo decades and decades of logic. So, we've seen it in just so many different areas. We've partnered with IBM around the Call for Code initiative, and we've seen all sorts of interesting projects and coding ideas that are really helping benefit our society as a whole. We've seen a number of our projects launch different diversity and inclusion initiatives, especially with a lot of the things that, at least for folks in the United States, that we have been seeing that, within our culture. I think, sometimes, pandemic, I think it's really been hard on all of us. It's been hard on a lot of our communities. Some of them really had a hard shift into getting into pandemic mode. But what I've always seen is when you see sort of these times of great stress and, great impacts like this, you also see a lot of great and unique positive things coming out of it. And I think we have just seen a huge number of projects flowing our way, and some in areas that I don't think we would have necessarily expected a couple of years ago. And maybe that's a little bit of pandemic. Maybe it's also just like a little bit of where we're at as a society right now. So, it's been interesting. I know probably both of you and probably everybody in our communities is hoping to get back together in person soon. And hopefully we're getting there.
So I just want to note that I was scrounging around looking for the data. I can't find it right now, but I read yesterday that something like 40% of surveyed people, I don't know who they were, but surveyed employees said they actually plan to leave their jobs when the pandemic is over. And then I thought, well, where are they going? Right? Which is, do they have another place in mind when they're going there? And I'm just putting that out there as just an item. I have one quick question before we start getting toward the close. We've only got like 7 minutes left here, which is that it seems like most of what we've talked about has been about companies and what the Linux Foundation does for companies and foundations within foundations and all that. And almost all of open source, at least traditionally or in the past, or at least in the great mythos of open source, starts with an individual scratching their own itch. It certainly did with Linux. I mean, Linus wanted a Unix of his own, so he made one and other people jumped in and here we are. And I'm wondering if individuals are involved, or is there any mindfulness toward individuals at the Linux Foundation, and to sort of try and keep that ethos alive. It's been a topic we've talked about a lot on the show here, but go ahead. Yeah, no, it's a very fair point, and I think sometimes the individual gets lost in the conversation. I mean, at the end of the day, companies don't contribute code; people do. People are the ones making commits. People are the ones doing those releases. So I think at the end of the day, it does come back to the people. I think the one thing that there's a few things that we have started to see take off quite a bit, because a number of our project communities, you often kind of get a little bit insular. Like you might have 3 main companies that are contributing, but then you're like, okay, well, how do I get more people involved? Like, how do I get, maybe we're all sort of, getting towards the end of our careers and we're hoping we carry this off to, another group. How do we get sort of the next generation involved? How do we get, students who might be very, very interested in some of these technologies? How do we, help them? All these communities are open, but, it can be intimidating sometimes, especially if you don't feel like you have a lot of technical background, if you don't feel like you have the technical chops, you might have a little imposter syndrome. So one of the things many of our project communities have been doing for a number of years, and in the last few years we've formalized it here at the Linux Foundation, is our mentorship efforts. And it's under our LFX mentorship platform. And really the idea there is that we are working with individuals, because these individuals are looking at these project communities and they're thinking, this is something I'm really interested in. Maybe I'm
wanting to get involved in this community because I want to use it as a launching off point for my career. Maybe I'm getting involved in this community because I want to build a business around this. And if I'm involved in these projects and I'm learning from these projects, I have a little bit of a head start. I have a way that I'm connected. Because I think more and more that we see the experts within the communities, they end up getting hired by a lot of these companies, or they go and start their own, groups in there, or some of them, just end up being those people that are the constant contributor, and they do it out of sort of the labor for love that they do, what they're working on, and they find it a ton of value for them. And, the beauty is all of the projects that we host here are completely open to anybody participate in. You don't have to do any sort of membership. You don't have to do anything special. Usually all the projects, they probably have some sort of like a contributor agreement or things like that. That's a fairly normal thing in open source, but there's no really other barriers. And all of our project communities, they spend a lot of time looking at the individuals out there, especially those that are starting getting new into these technology spaces and just wanting to learn more about it, because maybe they're going to use this to do something cool with. Maybe they're looking to build a career around it. I mean, I was talking with somebody in the Open Mainframe Project community about a couple of weeks ago, and he had basically, in the pandemic, he actually ended up leaving his job, and he started to get involved in a few of our project communities, and now he's using that to start his own little consulting firm around mainframe, and he's using his involvement in a number of these projects as a catalyst as he's talking to customers to say, hey, look, you can trust me to use this technology because I help contribute to it. I help write code in it. And that ends up being sort of a huge value point for people. So, the nice thing is the ethos of open source still doesn't change. I mean, how decisions are made, they're made by committers. They're made by the people that write the code. And if you're writing the code, you get to make the decision. And that doesn't matter whether you work for a big company, a small company, or you're just doing this nights and weekends because it's something fun for you. There's all those spaces, and we look to help promote that. We look to help make sure our events are very open for that. And we also make sure that there's trainings available there so that these people that are wanting to learn these technologies, they have an on-ramp for doing it. So, I truly believe that that's sort of one of the unique pieces here is that while we have a lot of larger companies that are obviously very much involved, at the same time, none of these project communities happen unless individuals come and individuals do the work. And these individuals can be from anywhere. And these projects become open and accessible because of that. And I think that's a huge important thing as we start to see many of these project communities grow.
So we're pretty much almost out of time right now. So we always close with a few standard questions. One you can answer as briefly as possible, which is, are there any things we haven't asked that you would like to answer just to get it out of the way before we close?
I think you've asked a lot right now. I don't think I could add anything great. It's probably about an hour from now. I'll think of something. So that's okay.
That always happens. So the second one, which is our control question, is do you have anything to say about blockchain? Of course, you guys have the Hyperledger going on there. We've had Brian Bellendorf on here before. But. Yeah,
I let's say I don't have anything better than Brian would say about it. So let's just leave it at that.
Okay. And so the last two are, what are your favorite scripting language and text editor?
So I grew up obviously around PHP. I was a contributor to it for quite some time. I've got away from PHP in the last few years. I started to do a lot more Python work, which is, again, I preface all this with saying my code's horrible, so nobody should ever read it or do anything with it. But I do have a couple of open source projects on GitHub. Usually, some of them are around, some tooling I use for, DCO work, or also maintaining some of the landscapes. So there's some bits up there with a bunch of YAML. Text editor. I use VI and Vim all the time. I used a lot of different editors, and I've just went back to text because it seems a lot of the modern editors are a little bit hefty. So I'm a Vim guy.
That's great. So thank you so much. This has been an action-packed hour, and I really appreciate it. Actually, there was somebody said something in the back channel that we'll save it for next time because it's excellent. It's been great having you on, and I hope we do have you on again soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the invite. Thanks, for you both hosting me here, and always happy to come back.
Hey, great. Thanks. So, Aaron, that was an action-packed hour, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, there's only so much, there's so much to talk about that we really want to talk about Linux Foundation and, as well as Open Mainframe. And so, yeah, it was kind of hard to know. There was so much to talk about. It seems like we could have talked for probably another hour about that kind of stuff. So, no, I think it was good that we did, though, because I think this is what's important to people right now. Not just the Open Mainframe part, but like for all these open source projects, how are they going to be sustainable? How are they going to keep going? This is the way forward, I think, for software development right now. So, there are some interesting questions, and we asked a lot of them, but there's also some interesting implications. Like if there was no Linux Foundation, probably, some of these projects would have died off already by now instead of continuing to develop and thrive.
Yeah, and I think we would have had, that situation I mentioned early on, which is what a lot of the companies would have done is just continued arguing among themselves and not really collaborating and not really having a structure in which to start working things out. This is one of the hardest things there is to do, is to find, work together on common interests of one kind, especially when you're learning at the same time. That's an interesting point toward the end there that, if we're functioning human beings, we're busy learning all the time. We can't stop, right? And so that changes us. Everything new that we learn changes us because we are what we know, right? And if we have a mechanism for sharing that and a mechanism for sort of nurturing that as we go along, then it works out. It works out a lot better. So I'm glad they're in the world doing what they do.
Yeah. And who knew that the Linux Foundation had so many courses on COBOL? Now we know.
Yeah, exactly. That's an interesting thing. I mean, it's somebody in the back channel. Does anybody still do programming in COBOL rather? And anybody know a COBOL programmer? And I know a couple of them. It's a married couple, and they had a really great COBOL outsourcing business that they retired, and they were retired, and then Y2K came along, and then they got employed again, and now they're back retired again and driving around in an RV. So. but I don't think any language should ever go away, so not completely, if it's useful, then it should be used. So it's plugs time. What do you have to plug there, Aaron?
So definitely people should check out my YouTube channel, which is called Retro Hack Shack. And I try to put out videos weekly as much as possible. It's obviously not my full-time gig, so I can't do that all the time. But I just had an interesting one recently, actually, where I had a piece of equipment catch on fire. That was my latest video. So that kind of made for an interesting break in between creating software for the Apple IIc. And I was testing out an old card, which lets you do screen shots. You could just hit a button on the Apple II, and it was called a fingerprint card. You could hit a button and it would screen print for you. It would capture whatever was on the screen to memory, and then you could print it out on your printer, which would have been very useful at the time for doing, documentation and things like that. So before you had, easy apps that you could, just capture the screen easily. It was a hardware implementation. So it's really cool. But yeah, the fire was a little scary, but everybody's safe. No long-term issues, but carrying a hunk of burning plastic to the sink to put out a fire was not what I had in mind for that day.
It reminds me of a time once, a long time ago, that I had, what time, like probably in the 50s or early 60s, had been a great television, back when televisions had vacuum tubes in them. And I decided to, I was going to test the tubes take them to a tube tester, and every hardware store had a tube tester in it. You could pull the tubes out of your thing and stick them in the tube tester. And I replaced a bunch of the tubes that didn't test out. They tested out in the yellow or the red, and I plugged them all back into the TV and turned it on, and it caught fire. I mean, it was like, oh my God, we have to drag this thing out of the house while it's burning. It was, I don't know, some paper wrapped capacitor in there or something like that. Just couldn't take a fresh load of electrons, and there it went. Anyway.
Well, I'm glad I'm not alone in my.
Oh no, it stank the house. Nothing. There's no smell like burning electronics. It's like, yes, we don't smell it as much these days, but yeah,
that's for sure.
So, guys, this has been great. Great having you on again, Aaron, and a great guest with John Mertic. And next week, this is what I have to look at and say, what's next week? What's next week? Okay, let's see. Jonathan Steck of Endless Sky, and Jonathan Bennett, in fact, is going to be hosting that show because I am going to be geographically inconvenienced for it. So he's going to take over next week. And it's just been great. It's been a great show. Thanks, everybody. This has been Floss Weekly, and I'll see you in 2 weeks, and the show will be back next week. Be a great show.
You know what's fun? Android. You know what's even more fun, though? All About Android. That's my show, Jason Howell, along with my co-hosts Ron Richards, Florence Ion, and we welcome guests on each and every week from throughout the Android ecosystem, developers, Googlers, journalists, people who are all geeked out about the Android operating system. We tell you everything you need to know. twit.tv/AAA every Tuesday. We'll see you there.